Hey everyone, welcome back to the Darko Ages. We're back to talk about another team that is near and dear to one of our hearts, or at least near, maybe not dear. The 2007 Michigan football team, the Wolverines from Ann Arbor. We're pretty excited about this one. This one might get a little saltier than some of the past ones. We've agreed a lot thus far. We found a lot of common ground talking about teams that we are all jointly fans of. In this case, we are not all aligned. So for those who don't know, Pat went to Michigan. Zach and I are both Spartans. This has been a long-standing rivalry for those two programs, but for our friend group as well. So we're excited to get into that. We'll kick it off. We'll start with Pat because he obviously is this is maybe the most personal thing for him. Pat, what were you up to in the fall of 2007?
Yeah, so I graduated from Michigan in the spring of 2007. We had an awesome team my senior year. I think we'll get into that a little bit more in depth in 2000. A lot of those guys, especially on offense, and a lot of the stars of that 2006 team returning in 2007. I was super hyped for the season. On the day the season started was my move-in day to my apartment in Chicago. So I wasn't in Ann Arbor. I was in Chicago with my parents. We had packed up a couple of cars of all my stuff, and they were helping me move into my apartment that day.
Hi, Zach, fall of 2007, where were you at?
I was going to Michigan State, as a matter of fact. Pat graduated college before me. I did, like as mentioned in previous pods, did a little bit of touring, maybe had some fun in college, that sort of stuff. But was living with my cousin in Capitol Villa at the time. Big ups to Capitol Villa. Great apartment complex at the time. No idea what it's like now. But yeah, just enjoying life.
It probably looks exactly the same.
Probably
I don't know.
A few more layers of paint.
Yeah, exactly.
Landlord special.
Yeah, so I was still living in Lansing. I had graduated in 2006, but for the podcast listeners, I immediately started working in Lansing, so I was still kind of hanging around, and a lot of my friends, like Zach and others, were still in school, so I was doing the working life but still living the college experience, which wasn't all bad, I gotta say. It was kind of fun, to be honest with you. So the 2007 Michigan football team, we'll just get a little bit of the stats out of the way before we get into the actual memories. They finished 9-4 on paper. Pretty solid record, pretty good season. They were 18th in the final AP poll, coached by Lloyd Carr, who we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. This was Lloyd Carr's final season as the coach of Michigan. And again, finished 9-4, but probably a pretty disappointing outcome for Michigan fans that really set things in motion in a way that's really interesting for the Big Ten, for Michigan, and in some ways for college football. So we're excited to get into that. We're going to talk with Pat. So, you talked about where you were. You touched on the 2006 team. Why don't you take us through your senior year, what happened in that team, and what that kind of meant leading into the 2007 Michigan football team?
Yeah, so the 2006 Wolverines were the number one defense in the country pretty much the entire year. They also had a loaded offense with Chad Henne, Mario Manningham, Adrian Arrington, Mike Hart, Steve Breston was on that team. Their offense, just Jake Long, like a future number one overall pick as the left tackle. So they were just completely loaded with talent and beat teams with a dominant defense. Brandon Graham, Lamar Woodley, Alan Branch, a lot of defensive line talent. They had some good linebackers on those teams, and they were famously 11-0 heading to Ohio State against an 11-0 Buckeyes team. And it was a eventful week leading up to the game. Bo Schembechler died in the week before the game, and I actually went to Columbus. One of my good friends from Michigan, his brother was in grad school at Ohio State, so we went down, and I think there was 5 or 6 of us went and slept on his floor. I was the only one who was able to scalp a ticket. They were pretty expensive. I think I got in midway through the first quarter and used some party poker winnings to some cash I got from party poker to buy my ticket. I think it was about like $500 back in 2006, so it was expensive. And it was a great game. So the game was actually, even though Michigan was the best defense statistically that season, the game was a high-scoring game, going back and forth, teams marching down the field. What an awesome, awesome atmosphere in the shoe. I did feel bad for the father and son OSU fans. The kid was probably about 8 years old, because I was getting just like a torrent of verbal abuse with a lot of inappropriate language for an 8-year-old to hear during the game. And Michigan came up short. There's a few big plays. Sean Crable had a 15-yard penalty on a play where they would have actually gotten off the field late in the fourth quarter. It was a game that felt like it could go either way, but the home team won with Troy Smith and the Buckeyes. They were loaded and they pulled it out. And it was my senior year, so even though we didn't win the Big Ten and we weren't going to be able to play in the BCS championship game, where Ohio State would then go on to lose to Florida and Chris Leak and Urban Meyer, a few friends and I decided to go to the Rose Bowl since it was our senior year. So we flew out and watched Michigan play against Pete Carroll and USC Trojans, famously John David Booty and Dwayne Jarrett. And they're both burned into my memory because Michigan basically was in control of the game, dominating the USC offense in the first half. And Pete Carroll is one of the all-time great football coaches, basically just said, this defensive line is too good, their front seven's too good, and stopped running the ball. So for the entire second half, I think they either didn't have a rushing attempt or had maybe one. It was definitely less than 5. And they just were kind of throwing up arm punts to Dwayne Jarrett. And Michigan's corners, they couldn't locate the ball. They couldn't defend these passes, and they lost the game. And it felt like both games kind of showed Michigan was a secondary away. And you fast forward to the next year, there was all this hype with all the offensive talent coming back. Michigan's ranked number 5 in the AP poll. They have senior Chad Henne, senior Mike Hart, Mario Manningham, Adrian Arrington. This team should be a dominant team, and they played App State. And Appalachian State at the time had a really good dual threat quarterback who was fast and could run, and they also ran a true spread offense. And Michigan struggled. Now, to be honest, I wasn't watching the game at the time. I've since watched it afterwards in what many Michigan fans have dubbed the horror in the Big House, where number 5 Michigan loses to Appalachian State. I don't think it can be oversold how big of an upset this was. I don't know of a bigger upset. Perhaps there is one by some metric, but I think because of the historical context of Michigan football and the Big House with the biggest stadium in the country, to have a 1AA school, FCS, I don't know which it was at the time, but to come in and beat the number 5 team in the country, was just, Michigan was basically laughed at. They went from preseason number 5 to out of the poll the next week. And so I'm sure you guys as Sparties fans remember the game, enjoyed the result. My one takeaway is I was moving into Chicago that day with my parents and found out about the score. I might have watched the very end, like when found somewhere to watch it. And then as it ended, I can remember my mom asking me if I was going to be in a bad mood the rest of the day. And I kind of snapped at her like, you don't understand what this means, how important this is.
So the answer to her question was yes, you were going to be in a bad mood for the rest of the day.
I did go get some deep dish with my parents. I think we went to like Giordano's or something. Full belly made me feel a little better. I was probably put you all on ignore for all my text messages and just hung out with my parents to forget about it.
Yeah, so, it ended in dramatic fashion, right? It was like a blocked field goal or something. So it was, despite I'm sure the terror of just being in this game that's going down to the wire. For Michigan fans, I can remember the game, also mostly just seeing the highlights because I was at a Michigan State game, I believe. But, they're like, okay, we're going to pull it out, which, obviously a non-FCS or non-major against a top 5 team, you don't ever want to be coming down to the wire, but that does happen fairly often in week 1. And then usually that's how it plays out, right? Is the bigger school makes enough plays down the stretch to pull it out, they kick the field goal, they win, and in this case, that's not how it happened. Yeah, I think this happened so long ago that I don't even know, texting was a minimal thing. I remember definitely calling and trying to leave you guys voicemails just taunting you because, we're going to actually do a pod about this era of Michigan State football, but we didn't have a lot to hang our hat on. So a loss in week 1 to App State for Michigan was certainly the year before would have been the highlight of our year. This particular year, we had just changed coaches, so things were starting to change a little bit. But yeah, at the time, we were just like, this couldn't be any better. Michigan just lost to App State. Day made, right? Michigan went on to lose week 2 to Oregon in a game that was also not that close. And, we had talked about it and obviously thought a little bit about how good the 2006 team was, but I hadn't really put it together that that's essentially going from playing for a BCS berth to losing 4 in a row in humiliating fashion, and probably sets the stage for why some of the things that happened as that season played out happened the way they did. But to the credit of Michigan and to Lloyd Carr, they then go on to win the next 8. So were you back in Ann Arbor for any of those? Were you starting to feel the turnaround a little bit?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot there. I do think we should get Zach's input on how much he was celebrating the App State loss as well. But I think that I was trying to make the through line with the 2006 team and the way they lost their games. They were competitive with, Ohio State won the Big Ten in the BCS championship, could have won the game, but their defense couldn't get stops. And it was speed on the edge and at receiver that really hurt them. Against USC, kind of the same thing. Also just some lack of tracking the ball in the air, some cornerback issues. They were not good in the secondary, and they were built to stop the run. So they had big linebackers, big safeties who were really stout in run defense, which, they're built to beat teams like Big Ten smash mouth football teams. And this era of college football, that was changing. There was some very famous spread offense coaches out there like Rich Rodriguez, who were having a ton of success at West Virginia. And another one was Oregon. Michigan loses to App State. I was going to move into Chicago into my apartment, but I had season tickets still at Michigan. I just didn't go to that game thinking it's a tune-up. I'll go back next weekend. I'll drive over from Chicago for the Oregon game. So now I have to come over where we've fallen out of the poll, and we get to play the Oregon Ducks, who are basically just a Power 5 version of Appalachian State. They have Dennis Dixon and Jonathan Stewart, who's awesome, and a bunch of speedy, talented wide receivers. And they just watched the App State game and said, this nickelback is a linebacker. We can just get this slot matched up on a guy who can't run with him, and we'll just throw a wheel touchdown. Michigan was so outclassed that day in the stadium. It felt just awful. And my 4 years of college at Michigan, we had one 7-5 season that was everyone dubbed a super painful season, the 7-5 year. Part of the theme of those teams, it always felt like they were underachieving their talent. This team felt like there was a mistake made in the level of talent that they had in the secondary. Now, I look back at the App State game, and I still think it was coaching malpractice. They should have schemed, watched film, and adjusted, and not try to play a 230-pound linebacker to cover a 185-pound wide receiver in the slot. It's not going to work. The issue was they didn't really have many corners. They had guys they had converted to corner, and and that had shown up in 2006 against Ohio State and USC, and then it carried over even bigger into 2007. Famously, I went the next week, and Henny got hurt, so he's not playing. They had Ryan Mallett, who was this 5-star biggest QB recruit since Henson, he was going to be the next big star at Michigan. And I went to the Notre Dame game the next week, and they just eviscerated Jimmy Clausen in Notre Dame. But Notre Dame was not running a spread offense. They were a pro-style offense who was going to try to run play action and drop back into 5- and 7-step drops. They weren't in the shotgun every play, throwing quick outs to a speedy receiver against Michigan's nickel. So what happened in the game? Michigan just caved in their offensive line with their dominant defensive line. I think they had something like 6 sacks. Clausen had I looked it up, negative 67 yards rushing. It was just Brandon Graham, 3.5 sacks, Sean Crable, 2 sacks, Tim Jamison, a sack. Like, their defensive line just dominates the game. And you kind of think, like, oh, this is how they have to win. But when you're going to go, if you go up against a team that's spread and shred, they did not have the personnel or apparently the practice. Like, they're also a team who, even though they had the offensive talent, always felt like it was underutilized. They would run, zone left to start every game, famously. Like, Mike Hart off tackle to the left was the first play of every game on purpose. Like, this is the tone we're going to set. This is the type of team we're going to be. And I guess the rest of college football was kind of like zigging at that point, and they didn't have the defense, the guys who could cover, 5 wide receivers, and it definitely hurt them. So after that Oregon game, I was kind of like, ooh, that was not an enjoyable weekend. Like, I remember driving in the car with my friend Samir on the way home, and it was like, we've lost the last 4 games, and each one has been like almost more devastating than the last. Now, in hindsight, the App State loss is the one everyone remembers. But the Oregon game, we had never been blown out like that. Like, as a Michigan fan, I'd never experienced that. And that felt like, man, we are so far away. So then they destroy Notre Dame. And so I went to that game and I was like, all right. And, started stringing together wins. As they got to the end of the season, Henne got hurt. I think it was his throwing arm, like shoulder, elbow. I don't remember specifically. He missed the Wisconsin game. So now you have a true freshman, Ryan Mallett, starting in Camp Randall. That went about how you'd expect. Wisconsin wins that game. And then Henne returns for the Ohio State game, which I also attended. He wasn't Chad Henne. He's clearly injured, trying to play with an injured throwing shoulder, and it was a struggle. So the Ohio State game ends. Lloyd retires, which I think was a lot of fan pressure. And
so let's table that Lloyd discussion and come back to that. Because a couple things, we should get to Zach. And like I said, Michigan State was coming off of an era. So I'm a year older than you. I was at Michigan State from 2002 to 2006, and we never beat Michigan in my 4 years there. Came close a couple times and had victory snatched out of the air like a fade to Braylon Edwards, literally. And Zach was right there with me. So Zach, like, what do you? Aside from being overjoyed at the App State thing, we'll give you a minute to talk about that. But as a Michigan State fan, you're watching this from afar, and are you just like, wow, we're watching the downfall of the Michigan football program, or what's going through your mind as you're watching them struggle from East Lansing?
Yeah, excuse me. I couldn't fathom losing to a Division II team. Not my program. I know that's for a fact.
They're not Division II.
Whatever.
They're FCS or 1AA. It's a different thing.
Yep. So sort of like the same reaction in real time, whereas, well, we're playing the FCS national champion. This is really like the 20th ranked team in the first division. There's always excuses for losses out of Michigan. The sort of an odd tidbit about that game is I believe it was the first Big Ten Network televised game. So it's this big grand hoopla for the Big Ten Network to have Michigan playing App State, and they crap the bed, get beaten by an FCS team, number 5, suddenly out of the poll. Everyone in the country is happy except for the graduates in the Walmarts. They're distraught, clearly. And then the next week just getting massacred by Oregon. A team that is coming into the new millennia versus, Michigan stuck in the old ways, etc. And we shouldn't hang our hat on beating Notre Dame, a team that won 3 games that year. So it's great. It's great that Michigan won that game, got that first one going, just like little Mike Hart promised. It was just a wild start to the year for that team. I just can't imagine the emotional roller coaster that Pat was going through.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we can come back to kind of how the season ended, but I think let's dig in a little bit to the actual makeup of the roster. You spent a lot of time talking about the defense and some of the limitations, but I do think we should talk about the players on offense. Like Chad Henne, I probably should have looked it up, was in the NFL as recently as just like a couple of years ago, still as a backup. And, Pat, maybe you can tell us about like when I remember him starting as a true freshman, and it was a little unexpected, but he ends up turning into this guy who's there for 4 years and experiences a ton of success. They had a ton of wide receiver talent every year. As a fan of Michigan State, I was like, yeah, they might run a basic offense, but they've got freaking players that are better. Players that are players that are better than all of ours. And it clearly didn't quite get them over the top in those years, but it was also a recipe for a lot of success. Like you said, other than 1 year, they were really with Chad Henne as their quarterback.
Yeah, Henne, he arguably could be considered the greatest quarterback in Michigan football history. I think J.J. McCarthy has a argument there. Obviously, Brian Greasy, Rick Leach. There are guys going back that you can argue. Jim Harbaugh. But Henne's the all-time leader in passing yards and touchdowns. He went 36-14 as a starter. So 9-3 as a true freshman, which is really impressive. Then that 7-5 year. Then 11-2 when they were 11-0 and lost those last two games. And then this season we're talking about 9-4. So he kind of had a close but no cigar kind of career. He was really good at throwing the long ball and decent reading. Obviously had such a long pro career despite not being, a great athletic specimen. He wasn't speedy, couldn't move much, but he could really sling the ball around and he could really loft a nice deep ball, which paid off to Braylon Edwards and paid off to Mario Manningham a lot. I, have a lot of fond memories of Chad. The interesting thing, like you alluded to, Kenny, as a Michigan State fan, I think the thing is some of those games with Michigan State maybe were closer even than they should have been. Like, I look back at this Appalachian State game, and I think that there's similarities to the game Michigan on Halloween 2 years prior came back and won, or I guess it was 3 years prior now, with Chad Henne as a freshman bombing it to Braylon Edwards. Lloyd Carr just was so conservative until he was forced to not be. And they had the talent where if you were aggressive and went for it, and I think analytics people have figured this out, like when you have the talent advantage, you need to press it. You need to play more snaps. You need to go for the deep ball more because you have these guys. If you have Braylon Edwards, you should probably press the issue and give him a chance to go make the play. He did that against Michigan State because they were losing by 3 touchdowns or by 17, whatever it was, in the fourth quarter, and you just had to. But he did that a lot, where it was like, all right, we're just going to, run and punt and play defense until we're forced to then say, oh, we've got these amazing mismatches on the outside. We should probably try to bomb it to them. And that's what they did in that App State game. They kind of tried at the end, and they were having great. Like, no one on Appalachian State can cover Mario Manningham. Like, the guy was incredible. No one in the Power 5 really could cover him. He was faster than everybody, and they had a quarterback who could hit him. So, like, to not be pulling that out until towards the end of the game was kind of malpractice. I think they kind of treated Appalachian State like I did. It was a scrimmage. I don't need to attend to this one. But I think because of the similarities with the Oregon team, like, they should have had a better plan on defense. You can't just say, like, hey, we're Michigan, we're going to go out there and dominate this team. You got to take every opponent seriously with respect and figure out how they could beat you and make sure you're prepared for that. And I think that if they would have been studying Oregon, it would have been the same plan. So that's why I don't understand the lack of, maybe they thought, okay, we can get by with this strategy with these, bigger linebackers and safeties, as our nickelback. We got like Engelman or somebody. It wasn't where football was going. That's how you stop a running game against tight ends, and that's how you stop Michigan, not how you stop a team like Oregon.
Do you think some of that is just, and this is an honest question, I'm not even poking fun, do you think some of that is just straight Michigan arrogance?
I think it's more likely the coaching staff, that's what they've done there. And they've probably all been in coaching for 40 years. And it's just like, this is how football is played. Like, the football was changing, and that's not that easy. Like, we kind of take it for granted, and like, we're in college watching all the games. And like, yeah, you can watch it, but you can say people have tried. I'm sure spread offenses had been tried, just not in the same exact way. So, like, I guess it's arrogance. Like, this has always worked. This is going to continue to work. This is how you win at the highest level. So this is what we're going to need to do. And it's interesting. We can talk about where this took Michigan football, but then the pendulum kind of swung and Michigan football kind of won again with the recent iteration by swinging back to the same kind of old tried and true formula. A win in the trenches. They had a lot more talent in the secondary as well in order to cover those spread teams.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I was actually thinking the same thing, but, it's not just Michigan, right? I mean, you've seen teams in the NFL all of a sudden go back to, whether it's the Lions, who really dominated in the run game, the Eagles just won the Super Bowl with a dominant run game. So, yeah, I mean, everything is a bit of a pendulum, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. I want to touch on just a couple of the other guys. Mike Hart, we got to just have the Mike Hart conversation. I see Zach already shaking his head. Well, I'll ask Zach this question. Zach, is I know this is a long list for you, but is Mike Hart your number one most hated Michigan football player, or is there someone else that takes that title for you?
Yeah, Mike Hart is definitely at least tied for first. There's nothing worse than losing a game and your rival's star running back coming out and just continuing to dunk on your head as much as he possibly can, and there's absolutely no chance he can dunk a ball unless it's hung in his basement wall. It's really, I just can't stand the guy. There's no part of me that appreciates anything that he did in spite of being the all-time leading rusher for Michigan. It's just whatever. He existed. They beat Michigan State. We stunk, and he got to walk all over us.
Yeah. When you go 4-0, you get to do it.
Yeah, you get to talk like that when you go 4-0. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I was kind of just thinking about him, and honestly, I think his size and, to some extent, athletic limitations were part of what made him so frustrating, because you're just like, why? He doesn't seem like he should be that hard to stop, but as you said, he's the all-time leading rusher, and just, sort of like the epitome of a really good college running back. But I'm going to go back just to the 2005 game, because that was a game I was at, and Pat talked about how conservative Lloyd could be, and that game was a great example. That was the game that Chris Perry, I think, ran it 50 times or something like that. And I was in Spartan Stadium for that one, and Michigan State's coaching staff at the time was looking at the wide receivers like, we can't cover these guys in single coverage. They just sort of refused, and were like, well, we're going to just try to make them be methodical, and it worked offensively. But even that game, to Pat's point, Michigan State ended up almost pulling it out because they got a fumble for a touchdown, and so this game that Michigan had really controlled was like a 3-point game late. Michigan did end up winning. Like I said, I never got to see MSU win. And like with Chris Perry, it was like, this guy's just an absolute beast bowling ball, where you're just like, yeah, it's not really a surprise that they give him the ball 40 times and nobody can tackle him. With Mike Hart, it's like, why can't people tackle him? It doesn't really make sense. So I don't know, Pat, what do you remember about him in terms of his play style? Like I said, he just seemed like he did everything well.
Yeah, so I got a funny story about, I think you were talking about the 2003 game at Michigan State would be Chris Perry. I was freshman at Michigan, came over to hang out with all of you yahoos, and participated in the ice luge for some shots, and I missed about half the game asleep on the floor. My sister and my brother-in-law lived in Lansing, so tailgated. I went to their house and was watching the game in the basement and totally passed out because had consumed a lot of alcohol. But the thing was, it felt, Chris Perry just ran for 6 yards a carry. It was, you can't stop us. That's going to be hard for you to win. Chris Perry graduates, and it was a big question because the whole identity of the team was Chris Perry on offense. That year, we beat Ohio State in Michigan Stadium. That was my only victory over OSU in my 4 years there. And Perry got hurt at one point, and they're coming out to check him, and the whole stadium was chanting, Perry, Perry. And, he returned to the game and everyone's going bananas. And he was a workhorse. So Mike Hart comes, he's this little guy. I mean, he's not big, and he's from a small program. He wasn't like a super heralded recruit, and he comes in and immediately pops as a true freshman, like right away, first game of the season, like, oh, this guy's good. And I think it's a lot of the things that people, when they look at running backs, like there are guys at the NFL Combine that's like, oh my gosh, look at that guy, he's huge and he's fast and he can super agile, but some of those guys don't work out because they don't have the instincts, they don't have the balance, they don't have the like strength and power where it's needed. So Mike Hart had all those things. He was able to, he wasn't going to outrun anybody in the open field, but he was going to be able to understand angles, take on a defender when he needed to get an extra 2-3 yards, to move the pile, always be falling forward. And interestingly, like he came back as the running backs coach at Michigan, and I think Blake Corum was the closest we've had to that part of a runner. So I don't know how much of that can be taught and coached. Mike Hart seemed to have it just when he got to Michigan.
Some of it's filmed, in the off season or during other teams' games. That helps with Blake having a nice year.
You think Blake Corum's success was due to Connor Stallions? That's what you're going with?
It's a theory.
Yeah, that sounds like a little brother theory.
Oh God, there it is.
Yeah, well,
I mean, if you're gonna pull out a little brother theory,
we made it. We made it to the 37-minute mark before the sniping really began. That's not bad. I thought it could have happened. I thought it could have happened sooner, to be honest.
Oh, I mean, like two Sparties, 2v1 that really want to do this pod about the 2007 Michigan Wolverines, so they can talk about Appalachian State and the embarrassing loss and the end of Lloyd Carr's career and the catalyst of Mark D'Antonio coming. We'll do that on a later pod.
Yeah, well, no, yeah.
You're choosing this podcast.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead, Kenny.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Although, and this is a good segue, because aside from the personal enjoyment that Zach is getting out of this at this exact moment, I do think in the spirit of this podcast of like trying to identify some teams that were fairly mediocre at times, we've kind of departed from that and done some really good teams that were lost, but that were interesting from a historical perspective. I think this one fits the bill. And, to make it up to you, Pat, we can either do a really bad MSU team, or we can do a great Michigan team at some point. Although, one of our guiding principles is still they can't win the national title, so you're not going to be able to do the most recent Michigan team. Let's get back to Lloyd Carr, because you mentioned at the top, and you just touched on it here, he retires at the end of the year. And I was doing a little research, and I think it's safe to say, I think the way that the folks at MGO blog put it is that given everything he had done for the university, that if he had wanted to stay another year, they would have let him do that. But it's safe to say that the fan base was ready for him to be done. Is that true? Is that how you felt, that it was just time for him to move on, essentially?
Yeah, we were spoiled with success. Lloyd Carr was a really good coach, but he did recruit extremely well. So a lot of the fan base just thinks that Michigan will, because of the resources, will always recruit that way. So then if they blame coaching when teams aren't, a championship, aren't winning Big Tens, aren't championship contenders. So losing 5 games my junior year was that was when the pressure first began on Lloyd Carr. That was a embarrassing season. We lost to Minnesota in the Big House in a game we never should have lost, against a Minnesota team that had good running backs, but couldn't throw the ball. It was just it was the same thing. It was the conservative offense and conservative game plan, and then try to flip it on when the game gets late and tight and hope you can win. And it's, why not just press your advantages the whole game? So I think the whole fan base felt that. We have more talent than this team. Why are we losing to them? But I think that takes for granted, just how good of a coach Lloyd Carr was, to always be in a position where you felt like you had more talent. You had guys who were coached up, who knew what they were doing, who weren't making basic mistakes, who and had talent through recruiting. So yeah, I mean, we got our comeuppance and found what happens when you hire someone that doesn't have full support of everyone inside the athletic department and try to make a drastic transition, and just how ugly and how much worse it can be.
Lloyd Carr has over 75% winning percentage at Michigan. That's just a kind of a great number, honestly. His first 2 years, 9-4, 8-4, and then wins the national championship, 12-0, baby. But it's sort of a weird end of the career too, and I wonder if that's a changing of the guard sort of situation where the game is just changing in the early 2000s at that point. He's stuck in older years, or if it's just whatever it is, it's the end of his tenure, and sometimes things get stale.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and honestly, I'm going back to something Pat said when you asked him about sort of the Appalachian State loss and whether that was like a bit of Michigan arrogance. I mean, I think it's a bit of just like football arrogance, as Pat said, but I think this is a good segue into just sort of where Lloyd Carr was at in both Michigan history and college football history. So his first year as the coach is 1995, and the 94 was the first year that the 85 scholarship limitation was fully implemented. They had been phasing it in. I mean, I think it's sort of fair to say that for most of Lloyd Carr's career as an assistant, they had, before that, scholarships at one point it was like 105. And, the TV landscape was so different that the best players really did just want to go to Michigan or Notre Dame or Alabama or wherever else where they knew they were going to be on TV. And so, it's hard to exactly blame Lloyd Carr for feeling like the recipe for success is just that we have better players and we should just line up and beat them, right? And so I do think that as the game changed, that's the efficacy of that strategy starts to diminish, and they kind of end up getting to the result that they got to. But to Zach's point about the winning percentage and Pat talking about his junior season, that 7-5 record was the worst season of Lloyd Carr's coaching tenure. So by all measures, he was extremely successful. Pat, you should probably talk about this too. It's also the nature of the rivalry with Ohio State, right? Where he was having success in the regular season, and but after 2000, I think 2003 was the last time he beat Ohio State, and so that was also working against him in that we can't get over the hump against this team in particular.
Yeah, I want to jump in here. Kind of, you mentioned 7-5 was the worst season of Lloyd Carr's career. I remember distinctly we've talked about this multiple times, Kenny, where I would kill for Michigan State to go 7-5 every year, be ranked like 25th or 30th, and like, good to go, we're getting a bowl game, cool. It's funny how expectations change. 7-5 is a perfectly fine record. It's not exciting, but it's not easy to go 11-2 every year, whatever it might be, or go undefeated. Like that's preposterous to think that coaches are going to do that every year. One point about Lloyd that's probably worth mentioning is that, and I wonder if this sort of helped the fans want to see him unemployed, is that his bowl record was not great. He had like 5 straight bowl losses leading up to his final season. I wonder if that was part of it.
Yeah, it was like the big game narrative. So bowl games, the Ohio State game, had some losses to Notre Dame. So those big prime games, it was like he always drops a game or two he shouldn't in the regular season and can't win the big game. So we're a step behind the other programs that we want to measure ourselves against. I think, yeah, all of that played into it. As a fan, I think we were well aware that we had a high floor, but it felt like we also at the time had a ceiling. And so you want to break through that ceiling and actually, win the title. So I think that's where Michigan fans were. I was excited to hopefully modernize the offense. That term probably is weird now. What does that even mean? But I did have concerns about the defense and where it would go. I mean, that was the identity of the program. And Lloyd was an extension of Bo. We went from Bo to Gary Moeller to Lloyd. And Gary and Lloyd were both Bo assistants. So it was, in some ways, it was all one long kind of tenure that was connected. And I think that there was a sense, like famously, I don't know how much as Michigan State fans you guys watched it, but, Kirk Herbstreit goes on game day and announces that Les Miles will be the next coach at Michigan. And then Les Miles comes out and says, like, no, I'm not taking that job. I'm going to win the national championship with LSU and, get an extension. So there's like insider chatter about whether that was real ever or not and how that came about. But it's pretty fascinating to think about whether they were trying to kind of keep going with the same bow tree, or what they eventually did was hire Rich Rodriguez and go with a complete program makeover. And I think at the time we were thinking, we have Ryan Mallett, we still have a lot of talent, this should go okay. But then Rich Rod wanted to run such a different offense and so completely different that Mallett transfers to Arkansas. They have basically no quarterback play. They were just abysmal on both sides of the ball and got off to a horrible start. And that kind of marred his whole tenure.
So, I was going to chime in before this, Pat, to say that we are not mean enough to make you have to go through the whole Rich Rod thing. Because,
it is the transition.
I was doing some research. Yeah, Zach's here for it. I don't mind either. I try to be the slightly kinder, gentler MSU fan, which, Zach's about to yell at me for that too. So I guess if it makes you feel better, Pat, Zach's ire for Michigan is strong enough that even MSU fans can get it if they aren't anti-Michigan enough, which is on brand for him in this circumstance. So, I did do some research. One of the reasons I thought this was interesting is that Michigan's not alone in terms of going through this exercise of what do we want for, particularly among the biggest programs, right? So I did a little research. So Mac Brown, career record at Texas, 158-48, not that dissimilar to Lloyd. They fire him or ask him to leave. Again, it's always a little unclear when you have these longtime coaches whether they're being forced out, but certainly Texas fans were ready for another chapter. They proceed to go 6-7, 5-7, 5-7, 7-6, 10-4, 8-5. So there's just no guarantees. And then, look at Miami, which when we're starting college is in the Butch Davis, Larry Coker dynasty. They are just crushing everyone, and they move on from Larry Coker, and they didn't win double-digit games again until 2017. So, I do think there is maybe a bit of a lesson here for power programs, that nothing's guaranteed in college football, especially and the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about this era is as this landscape changes, where there are definitely still advantages to the big blue blood programs, but you still have to have the right coach in place, or you can find yourself wandering in the wilderness for quite some time. So, and obviously Michigan had that experience before eventually getting back on track.
Your examples there made me think of Bo Pelini at Nebraska, who was winning 7 to 9, maybe 10 games some years, and a good program, but not really at the level of contending for the Big Ten title. And then they fire him, and they have not been good since.
Right.
Maybe Matt Rule can get it together, but it's been a struggle. So yeah, the grass is not always greener. There is a lower floor for these programs that are winning 7, 8, 9 games a season. Even if you have a high level of talent coming in and some inherent advantages, you can screw it up with the wrong hire and the wrong coach.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, both in terms of that context. In doing a little bit of the research, apparently there was a very brief bit of Harbaugh chatter in 2007. Pat can probably fill us in on this. He apparently had some sort of negative relationship with the athletic department at the time, where he had been critical of Michigan from afar. And so it's interesting to think about, what happens if he's not as hot a coach as he is when Michigan ends up hiring him in 2015, but he's sort of an up-and-coming coach. Had that relationship been better, what happens with Michigan's program? It's not hard to say they have more success than they did under Rich Rod, but it's, you don't know if things turn out exactly the same. And I do think, Pat can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you ended up getting 9 years out of him in 2015. You probably get a similar time frame, because eventually he definitely wants to go to the NFL.
Yeah, that's a good question. You might even have got less, because he probably would have been an even hotter name if he had immediate success at Michigan. If Lloyd would have stuck around for maybe 2 more years, I think then probably that Harbaugh would have been a realistic candidate. I think he was not long into his Stanford tenure.
Yeah.
at this time, so nobody really considered him. Like, they just didn't have a track record enough to be like really considered, I don't think, for the job. It's the stuff with the athletic department. He basically had made comments, he's ultra competitive and goes to Stanford and wanted to accentuate Stanford's academic pull for recruits. So he tried to basically say that, like, take a jab at the class load of the Michigan football players. Mike Hart, like, went in the media and shot back at him about it. And so it was a back and forth. It would probably be even a bigger deal if it was like 10 years later with like Twitter and all the social media, but at the time it was like on ESPN and everybody talked about it. And, I know you got Zach obviously has a lot of hatred for Mike Hart, but in addition to his work on the field, he had a little penchant for making good sound bites for the media. So he would say, famously after the game in East Lansing this year in 2007, when he made the little brother comment, but also, the stuff with Harbaugh and guaranteeing some victories, he was not afraid to go to the media and be really outspoken.
Yeah, we do remember that. And well,
yeah, I
unlike
glossed over that game when talking about the full season, but I was actually in Zach's apartment for the game, watching the game, and it was basically the same script. It was Michigan not pressing their advantage through 3 quarters, and then Mike Hart made the comment, but it wasn't Mike Hart all of a sudden coming alive. He gets all his carries early in the game, and then Henne to Manningham is the backbreaker that changes the game. So, it was just do that in the first quarter. That's kind of how it felt the whole tenure, or at least while I was in college. Obviously when they won the national championship in 97 and those years in the late 90s, they kept beating Ohio State. So things were good for Lloyd, for a decade, or close to it. And then Tressel gets hired at Ohio State and things turned, and Tressel guaranteed victory over that school up north, and that was kind of a turning point for Lloyd too.
We talked about sort of Lloyd in this additional era, and I do think he at the time, he just kind of not trying to make fun of the guy, he had kind of an old looking face, so he felt old when he retired, but he was only 61. Maybe he was 62, but he was in his early 60s. Tom Izzo just turned 70 and is still coaching. He certainly wouldn't be coaching now, but he definitely could have stuck around a few more years, which might have just sort of changed the whole landscape of both the Big Ten and Michigan football, certainly. Maybe we can dive into some of that when we talk a little bit more about Michigan State.
Yeah, I think, though, one of the things is momentum and perception is reality for programs in college football. So as the fan base starts to think you have a ceiling, and as more seasons play into that, it's just becomes harder and harder to then overturn or change those narratives. Even if you are relatively close, you just stop getting the quarterback recruit that you could get 5 years ago. You stop getting the wide receiver recruit because everyone says, well, you don't utilize this guy the way he should be utilized. So evaluating Lloyd from the late 90s to how he would have been and if he was still coaching in 2010, I think it's not an apples to apples comparison, because you have to think about like where the program momentum was and how people recruits viewed them, how assistant coaches who are looking to advance their career. In one side, you're like the up and coming place where everyone wants to go to as a stepping stone to later. Oh, I guess I could go there and it will be good, but are we going to get fired? So once that there's all these questions, I think that it kind of can start a downward spiral. So I don't think he was trending up. 7-5, 11-2, 9-4. You could look at that and think that's fine, but like you said, 7-5 was his worst season, and then he only wins 4 games 2 seasons later. So I think that it was getting towards the end for him either way.
Yeah. So more thoughts and questions around Lloyd Carr, because I think it's just super interesting for the era and the time. But are football coaches and Lloyd Carr's kind of prototypical what you think of a football coach being, where you're going to line up and we're going to beat you, we're going to pound you to death. Our football coaches one of the few groups, or maybe the only group, where they don't want to adapt, they don't want to change. This is what we run. This is what we're going to do. I don't care how the other team does it. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that. It's just the nature of the way football is played. It's 11 on 11. So you have 11 players on the field at any one time. You've recruited these guys to play a system, something you want to do, and you know how they fit. And like we talked about earlier, like a lot of coaches have been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years, coaching specifics of technique, where as fans, we can watch like running play to the left off tackle, and it can look the same in the backfield, but two entirely different blocking schemes where requires like a zone scheme versus a gap scheme can require totally different footwork from the offensive line. And it's not that easy to then say, okay, we've been coaching you up to do this, to step this way off the snap every time. Now we're going to pivot and have you step completely differently, maybe horizontally rather than vertically, left, right, like short, long, like all of this stuff matters. And you have, not only do you have to transition the player, but the coach needs to know all the ways to teach it and how to implement that scheme. And that works on both offense and defense. So you have these kind of schemes that, and I think if you have success for a long time, obviously you're less likely to change. You think my schemes work and I'm going to, keep rocking these. I do think coaches they're hyper competitive and are constantly changing. But I think in football, it's more difficult to steer the train in a totally different direction than in some other sports where it's, like in basketball, it's 5 players. The makeup of your team can change so drastically if you have like a heliocentric player versus, a lot of guys who could shoot or something. There's like all these different variables that you constantly have to tweak to the team. Football, you kind of get a guy, you say, here's the position I want you in, and you teach them to play that position.
Yeah. So I'll actually kind of build off that, and I promise to the listeners, I didn't even like plant that question, but it's like a perfect segue to one of the things I was going to ask you about that is really related to that. So, we talked about Lloyd sort of being in this transitory period. His career overlapped, like I said, with sort of the changing scholarship rules. They instituted the BCS the year after he won the national championship. And Pat mentioned at the top that you started, and Zach talked about it too, but you started to see these sort of more spread offenses, and the game was changing. It felt like there was this sort of time of innovation, and those big programs still had some inherent advantages for sure. But we talked about Miami, we talked about Texas. I mean, there's a lot of examples of big programs that struggled at times as the game sort of changed. I guess what I was thinking about, and what I'm curious what you guys think is with NIL is, do you think that that's going to actually be, it's going to be harder? So, I mean, coaches are always going to be trying to innovate, but it feels like now you have a coach at sort of a mid-level program. It's always been the case that they start having success and a big program might grab them, right? But now you also have the thing where their players start to have success and instantly their roster is getting poached. And so, do you think that that's going to change the way that coaches are going to have these long tenures? Or to me, it seems like because it's going to be so resource based, it's going to almost be like a return to those traditional powers. But I don't know if coaches will stick around in that. It's just interesting to think about Lloyd's career. He retired less than 20 years ago. The game feels very different at the moment.
Yeah. I think one of the things I loved about college football, I thought about this analogy this morning. Where I live, we have a bunch of banana trees. And before I moved here, I didn't know how a banana tree worked, but each stalk grows up a big bunch of bananas. And then to get the bananas down, they're high. You machete the whole thing down because it won't fruit again. And then a new stalk comes up out of the base, basically. You wait, it grows up, you cut it down when they're ready, but they're still green. And then we hang it up. There's this huge bunch of bananas. And then they all turn yellow. They all ripen at the same time. And now I have 40 bananas that I have to eat in 3 days. And that's a little bit I like that analogy for how building a college football program was. Like, you acquire this talent, you get freshmen in, they're green, you have to coach them up, develop them, you start to like see their, and then maybe you have a 1 to 2 year window to try to like win a title. There's been a few teams like Alabama recently who's been able to just have so much talent coming in that they can do it over and over again faster than other teams. But most championship teams in history were like this team who had some success as freshmen and sophomores, and then when they're upperclassmen together with maybe some more good freshmen and sophomores, but that collection is able to build into a championship team. Now it is different. It's like you can go shopping and bring in the guys to plug all your holes and fill all those needs. And like Ohio State, I don't think wins the title without the transfer portal. This past year, they got their quarterback, their running back, their safety. All of these guys were not recruited there, and that's just the new normal. I'm not sure, was your question if they're going to, like, it's so different is my point. I don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question was, like, Oregon now has been a team that has been a power for quite some time, right? But like when Michigan lost Oregon, my recollection was, they're a Pac-10 team. They're a good program, but you're not going into that game going like, man, had you not lost Appalachian State, maybe things would have been different. But on the preseason schedule, you're not like, we're playing this traditional power Oregon, right? It's like, oh, we're playing a Pac-12, Pac-10 school, and they're coming out here, and they might play a little bit of a different style. But I guess I just don't know if, and maybe to tie it a little bit to MSU, and Mark D'Antonio, by the time he's done, he has this reputation of being this great talent evaluator and or developer, right? Where he's, especially in his early years, he's occasionally bringing in a recruit that maybe was recruited by Michigan or Notre Dame, but the vast majority of his classes are guys that were not highly recruited by the power schools. In fact, he talked a lot about how he was like recruiting in Ohio for these guys who had chips on their shoulder because they didn't get Ohio State offers. And whether you think that his success was scouting or development, he clearly had found a way because if you watch those teams, they clearly weren't at a talent deficit once you actually saw those guys on the field. But now, until you get that established, if you're just in that early period where you're growing, I feel like those guys that you start to identify when you're a 7-5 team but are going to grow in are likely to get poached by some other team. Is it possible to just sort of organically grow a program into more than just like a 1-year contender?
Well, the one thing I don't think is possible is probably there's not going to be another Appalachian State beating a top 5 team because their quarterback would have been paid a ton of money to come to, like, he wouldn't have been there that season that they beat Michigan. So I do think that there's going to be an effect that trickles down, right? Like, so Alabama's going to steal stuff from Michigan State, and Michigan State's going to steal guys from Cincinnati. And on down the ladder in college football. So you can look at Indiana this past year, and historically not a good football program, but hired a coach who's able to bring a lot of guys with him. And that continuity, these guys that were experienced and could play, that led to a lot of success.
Yeah, that is exactly kind of what I'm thinking when I ask if college coaches are the most stubborn because they just want to run their scheme. And isn't that kind of more important than ever now, where if you're obviously recruiting for what you want, but now you're going across the portal or whatever to find guys that are going to fit this scheme because you're losing 4 at a time and gaining 4 at a time. You're not just recruiting a class, you're recruiting a class plus live recruiting your current roster because they're going to leave and come at the same time. I mean, maybe it's good that coaches are stuck in their ways because if they have a scheme or a program that's going to work, they can recruit to that at some level now.
Yeah, I mean, so thinking about D'Antonio and Lloyd, it was like D'Antonio had to build his program at Michigan State, but he had success at Cincinnati. Like, he knew what he wanted to do, who he wanted to be, and how the program was going to operate. And he was able to bring guys, like you said, with a chip on their shoulder. But I think that, like, when you bring guys that are willing to work, if you get a guy who in high school runs a 4.6, and a guy who runs a 4.7, but the one guy comes with a chip on his shoulder and works out harder every day, he's going to be faster in 3 years. Like, that's just how it works with strength and conditioning. So I think a program like Michigan under Lloyd, the program itself had a lot of the development. Like, everything had been the same for so long that I think that, like, you come there, you accept what like you're coming into. The challenge I think coaches face now is this guy that I'm bringing in might be super talented, but is he going to fit the culture and the personality of our current guys on the team? Like, you don't want to pay a guy, bring him in, it pisses off somebody else on your team who's also important, they clash and don't get along. Like, navigating all of that is going to be really, really difficult. You know, these are 18 to 24-year-olds. They're not like professional NFL players who are like there to work and get their paycheck. They're, you know, there to party and be on TV and like get to the NFL. So there's a lot of like different motivations I think college kids have that it's probably really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I think it is, you know, maybe it never wasn't important, but identity, program identity matters as much now as it did in 2007. You think of every great Michigan team, it was they were going to pound you to the ground and they were going to win the game. And then they flipped to Rich Rod, and it's a completely different scenario. And it was a really brutal 3 or 4 year stretch, whatever it was. And then they changed their identity back to kind of what it was, and Hoke was fine or whatever. I loved him. But then really found it with Harbaugh, of course, who was more the pound and ground type of guy and could have that identity. It's this, when we talk about the Lions and their draft picks, we don't know. We were like, who is this guy? He wasn't playing a ton, but he's a culture and fit guy for the identity of the Lions, you know?
Yeah, and I think, well, to get back to the idea of that we talked about around impatience, I do think the money aspect is also going to put coaches into, I mean, so donors have always had an ability to influence programs, right? Like, there's no question about that. But I do think that as some of these big donors are putting millions of dollars into literally paying players in the landscape that we have, it's funny because they're not getting like a monetary return on their investment. Their return is they get to see the team they care about win, which is a whole other just like wild thing that we don't probably have to go down that rabbit hole. But like, thinking about a coach like Lloyd, who had been there a really long time in an NIL world where the pressure on him to change the offense or to that like 7-5 is not going to be acceptable with the resources that Michigan is bringing to bear in this landscape. So I do think, coaches, a college football coach, I feel like has always been a little bit of a CEO, right? They've always had to manage the roster, manage the assistants, manage the program, but it does feel like maybe that's even more so the job now than the actual coaches, than coaching the X's and O's, which is kind of the thing that Zach started us talking about here is like the relationship between scheme and everything else. And Pat just sort of talked about managing personalities and like having to re-recruit a roster. It's just like the job is just very different than the job that Lloyd Carr left in 2007.
Yeah, it's way different. It's so different. I don't know that I like it, but whatever. I renewed my season tickets again.
Well, maybe that's the last thing I was going to ask about, because Zach and I were texting about this. Like, Pat, how many Michigan football projected starters for this upcoming team do you think you can name without like quickly Googling the depth chart, like offense, defense?
I pay pretty close attention, so I could name a lot. They haven't had as much turnover as a lot of teams. They had added some transfer portal guys, but certainly not as many as I could 4 years ago, where I pretty much at this time could name them all.
Yeah, Zach and I were at like 4. Now, granted, Michigan State has been, between the Mel Tucker era and rebuilding from the Mel Tucker era, has been in the transfer portal more so than others. But, I mean, you just rattled off most of the defensive starters from a team 20 years ago. Maybe you're not the target for that question, but I do. It's changing the nature of our fandom, right? In that Like, things feel much more transitory and temporary. I mean, you talked about it from like a program building, but from a fan perspective, that experience you talked about of watching the team grow is like one of the joys of college athletics. And frankly, you don't appreciate it when you're also in college because you're the same age. But now that we're a little older, it's like I can kind of remember being a 19-year-old moron. And so like watching 19-year-olds and you're like, oh, I can watch you as a freshman make this dumb play. And then 2 years later, watch you perfectly execute the offense is one of the fun things about college sports that is just very different than it was.
Yeah. Now you get to watch that player make that play for another team.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that was a huge joy. Like, and I, as like a super fan of the sport, when a lot of my fellow Michigan fans had kind of given up on a lot of those Rich Rod, Brady Hoke seasons, I still wanted to watch every game because I was eager to see how those guys were developing for the next season. Like, even if we've already lost 4 games, I want to know who we can move forward with, how these guys are going to. And now it's like Michigan basketball this season I couldn't have named any of the guys, after last season. And they brought back one player from their rotation. And it was all transfer portal guys. And they were a good team, but I wasn't invested with it because I had never watched any of these guys until this season. So I was just like, wow, this guy's really good. Where's he from? Harvard or Yale or whatever? Yeah, Yale. I was just like, oh, cool. Like, where did he come from? And it's just weird. You didn't get to watch them go through the growing pains to struggle, but say, hey, stick with it. In a year or two, this guy's going to be really good. And so we're going to go through that struggle to get to the payoff.
Or if you're in a program that's really healthy, you don't even have to watch the team struggle. You're just watching the guys play special teams or like come in late in games and you're like, ooh, that guy is intrigued. He's going to be the starting safety in 2 years or next year, right? And, now you definitely don't get that level of experience. Like you said, we're struggling to name the starters, let alone the guys who are going to be there 2 or 3 years from now. So the one thing I wanted to talk about while we were talking about coaching changes, because I don't remember exactly where Pat was at on this, but it's funny because we talked about, sort of the expectations at Michigan that people were ready for Lloyd to move on. And coming out of the COVID season in particular, there was a lot of folks that were feeling the same way about Harbaugh, right? Like he had really struggled in that year, which, as it turns out, that year, if you look across the college football landscape, there were lots of teams that just didn't play up to expectation or vastly exceeded expectations. It was just like a bizarre year, right? But even in 2021, when they're good, they lose the game to Michigan State, and people are just very frustrated with his whole personality. But in this case, they clearly made the right decision because they go on to have probably the best run of Michigan football ever, or at least since Bo. I don't know. So
yeah, the best.
Lessons learned, Pat.
They beat Ohio State in 2020.
Oh, that's right.
They lost
that's
MSU.
Right.
Their only losses that year were MSU and then to Georgia in the playoffs. And then the next year was TCU, which was abysmal. And then the following year finally broke through. So they kind of, I actually went to the Rose Bowl 2 years ago, and we talked about this, like me and other Michigan fans. Like, it is cool that we got to see this team got to the apex that was still built kind of the old way. It was all these guys we watched struggle in 2020 that are now, like, Blake Corum was on the team in that COVID year and lost to Michigan State in an empty Michigan stadium, but had one awesome touchdown run in the first half that I remembered and was like, oh, this dude's gonna be really good. He's really fast. And so to see those guys develop and throughout their career felt like kind of we got to experience one of the more closer to the old system before this kind of full blown free agency new era. So, I mean, lesson learned that I think the COVID thing was a very specific issue. Jim Harbaugh, there's some similarities with Lloyd. He was basically just couldn't beat Ohio State. And the program was in really good shape from the moment he got there. 2015, you guys had another joyous occasion. But Michigan went from being pretty embarrassing in 2014 to a really competent, good football team. And then 2016, I think they were legitimately, if they beat Ohio State, they had a chance in the playoff. And then, 2017, he had these years. He had a couple years where he got like blitzed by Ohio State on defense, and kind of some similarities to that final Lloyd season. They got beat by slot receivers, beating their nickelback was too slow. And it was just like, that was who they had. The matchup got exploited. They were able to find guys to fill that hole, get to the apex. It was super rewarding. It felt like a reward for basically everything that had happened since this 2007 season. Like we went through the Rich Rod years. It was rough. We had one Hoke reprieve year, which was super interesting. Like, I was at the Sugar Bowl and was literally like going like this, how are we winning? Like, our team was like, we had a fake punt where he threw the ball and it bounced off 7 people. It was just dumb. We got so lucky to win. We were not as good as our record showed, and that was kind of like the high water for Brady Hoke's tenure. So then to have Harbaugh come in, steady the program, and take him to the apex. And then, like you said, he's always been like, he never hid his desire to win a Super Bowl. So I was kind of expecting him to leave when he did. And then you kind of start over, and like, what kind of program are you going to have? And you're right. Part of that might be that he doesn't want to navigate this whole new system. Had success with the old system, and this is totally different.
Yeah, I mean, you saw Saban retire at around the same time. I mean, you've seen coaches on the basketball side. You've seen big-name coaches decide to retire. Interestingly, I mentioned Jim Harbaugh, currently 61. Like I said, retired at like 62, which is sort of wild to kind of bring it back to the Lloyd Carr and 2007 talk. I don't know, anything else we want to touch on that team, or big picture college football thoughts? Do we need to get any Jalen Brunson takes off our chest so we can get back to feeling united in our hatred for the Knicks?
No, I have nothing positive to say about Jalen Brunson. I do want to say that Pat's banana reference there, his story about his metaphor about, chopping down a banana tree and you're watching them grow or whatever. I didn't appreciate that the bananas start green and you don't care for them, but when they're good, they're yellow. Like, that's all.
Fruit in college football. That's how it works.
Yeah. Zach really, man, that is a true Michigan State fan who is
so
will not miss a slight. He's mad that bananas start off as green. Man shakes fist at clouds.
I actually thought Zach was going to be more grumpy during this entire podcast. I feel like his true personality and hatred for Michigan we only got like a glimmer of that.
Yeah,
we're gonna save it for when we, like we said, when we do the Michigan State equivalent, and Zach can get into why. This is what they call a tease in our business, that we're sort of, I don't know, business isn't probably the right word, but anyway, we're planning to come back to talk about that one, and yeah, I think we can get into why that whole incident was just like. I mean, we talked about Mike Hart. I guess give him credit. He knew like what to say to push buttons, because what he said about Michigan State was the exact thing to just enrage Michigan State fans for, well, let's see. It's 18 years, and I can still see Zach looking angry just thinking about it. I still don't like you, Mike Hart, but I guess I'll give you credit for that. You were good at getting under people's skins. So, okay, anything else? What else do we want to talk about? Are we good?
It's definitely a forgettable football team, the 07 Michigan Wolverines. There's no, you have all this promise that doesn't amount to anything. And that's kind of the nature of the podcast, right? We're going to definitely get into that with Michigan State on our next one. And there probably wasn't promise for those teams, but when you're Michigan football, you expect roses every year, and sometimes you get Capital One Bowl, and those are the breaks.
I'm going to mostly ignore that, but we didn't talk about the Capital One Bowl. So Lloyd had already been announced his retirement. Rich Rod had been hired. Michigan goes to play this bowl game, and they just have an incredible offense where they're featuring Adrian Arrington and Mario Manningham in a way they like never did their entire careers at Michigan. Like, I don't know what Henny passed for. It felt like they were just completely unstoppable. They trounced Florida. It's like Their offense was so good, and it was like, we could have just been doing that, the whole time. Like, why were we so conservative? He went out with a bang after there was, I guess his career wasn't on the line, or just like wanted to have fun, or I don't know what it was, but they were awesome in that bowl game. And so the season was bookended with very, very different feelings, from the App State loss being pure misery to that Capital One Bowl, like, oh, we got a new coach, new era, and just went out and destroyed Florida, which is always fun.
Hopes were high. Little did you know, for the next 5 years, 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, we knew pretty soon. Like, the next year against Notre Dame, when they had like 7 fumbles in the first half, couldn't catch the ball. They were just atrocious. Like, what is that?
Yeah. Well, that's, man, we're gonna get off topic, but that's, I had never realized that. I had forgotten about that. But in Mel Tucker's opening game in that COVID season, they fumbled 5 times against Rutgers. Turns out, if your team looks like they haven't practiced in their season opener, it's not a good sign for the success of that coach. So despite a quick, brief period of hope that got Mel Tucker a lot of money, but we're way off topic.
Yeah, it's a fun topic, though. I talked about this. This is my second time name dropping Samir on this pod. I've talked about this with him quite a bit, and his thing is, like, you can tell who a good coach is immediately watching their team. Like, you can see competence and you can see incompetence. Like, there are guys in between where maybe they're not going to achieve a ton and they look okay, but like, there are like, the difference is immediate. And that was true when Jim Harbaugh took over for Brady Hoke. I think it was true when D'Antonio took over the MSU program. Like, there was just a level of and buy-in from the players that doesn't allow you to have like that many mistakes and to look that ugly. And so if it looks that bad, like, it's probably going to continue. It might get a little better, but it's not. Right. It's like, it's gotten that way for a reason. Like, those guys, yeah, it's their first game, but like, they've spent lots of hours practicing football. So if they look like they haven't practiced football, you probably got an issue.
Yeah, it's funny. That was, Zach and I were talking about that repeatedly last year, watching the new John Smith year. And again, the bar under Mel Tucker was impossible for the bar to be lower. But we repeatedly were like, wow, we actually look like we practice again. Now, the landscape is different, and whether he'll ultimately be successful, we'll see, I guess. But yeah, you definitely could see, like, oh, we actually have a game plan to stop what the other team is doing. And yeah, they might beat us because they've got better players. We don't, the Mel era, it's like, had we ever watched any of their film, guys are just running wide open up and down the field. Like, what are we doing? It's not like your players aren't good enough. They're just nowhere near being in position to make a play. It's like, what is happening? So
yeah, nobody knows what to do.
And to circle it back, I guess that is one thing that to get back to Lloyd and that particular team, I don't think you would ever say that they looked unprepared. They might have been too conservative. They might have been out-talented or had the wrong guys in the wrong matchups, but they were always prepared. They always had a game plan. So I won't speak for Michigan fans, but
that's how you go
through a competent coach.
Yeah, that's how you go through such a long career of your worst year is 7-5. I mean, that's like, how to coach football. Now, can you, if other programs have the same advantages as you and are at that same level of competency, but also are able to kind of add on top of that, does that separate them? And that's kind of where it felt like with Lloyd, where it was at the end. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe it was just like the cycles of programs, and he would have, if he had 3 more years, got them back up to being Big Ten champions. I think, so that's like the 2 different schools. So the last thing is like, oh, you can tell immediately. So in that way, like, your team struggles, you should move on from a bad coach. But at the same time, there's the other thing of like, it can take a while to actually build your program up. Like, Harbaugh got them to competency quickly, but he didn't get them to a Big Ten championship, for 6 years. I think it was his 7th season. It can take a while to like get all the way up. I think it's interesting to talk about. You just brought up the transition from like Tucker to the new John Smith regime, and how it went from low expectations at the end of the Tucker tenure. Sharon Moore is the complete opposite situation. He took over for a team coming off a national championship, and they did have basically incompetent quarterback play the entire season, managed to somehow beat Ohio State and Alabama, which was insane. I think had those results not gone Michigan's way and they not get Bryce Underwood, I think that there'd be a lot of negativity around the Sharon Moore future. Obviously, you are your record, so he won those games kind of but with defensive line talent and just being able to win the game with a few big plays from the running game. But I don't know, how do you guys feel as MSU fans, how the program's going to stack up? Is this year going to be a telltale sign where those programs are with each other? Is it should they be more level? Do you expect to move up in the Big Ten?
Maybe this is a response for the next pod, but I liked John Smith's reaction after the Michigan game. Hated his reaction, but liked it, sort of thinking about it more. He didn't realize how much it mattered, which I thought was a bizarre response to the sort of question about how did you prepare for the game? What'd you think of your first time playing at Michigan Stadium? He didn't realize how much it mattered to the fans of Michigan State, and his immediate response to that was that he'll never be that unprepared for that game again. So I think that's a positive, right? You're accepting that you made a mistake and you know what it was and you want to make that change. For Michigan State, I'm always 8-4, baby. Give me an 8-4 season. That would be so tasty.
Yeah, that quote from Smith is interesting to me. I wonder if that's actually even true, or if that's just a way of him shouldering the blame to say we're close and we could win if I do something a little different. I like that from a coach when they take responsibility rather than say well, we got to build up our talent more, out hit or whatever. What's his name at Nebraska would always say we're not even competitive with Iowa, and it's why would you throw your team down like that? Shoulder the responsibility so guys want to go out there and compete for you. Weird.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, and that's essentially what you just said is exactly what Mel Tucker said repeatedly in his first year, where he's just well, we just don't have the talent to compete with Alabama, and we're going to treat this like a pro program and bring guys in until the talent level is good enough. And we saw how that turned out, right? I mean, he caught lightning in a bottle with Ken Walker, but otherwise, you just create this entirely transient culture. But to your question about John Smith, I mean, it's a big year for Michigan State. I think, like I said, last year they looked much more competent. They looked organized. I mean, his track record at Oregon State is he clearly knows how to coach football. It's part of the reason I asked the question about the NIL climate is whether that sort of X's and O's competency that he brings is enough to get them back into the upper echelon, even if they're not competing for Big Ten titles. To Zach's point, can they just be in that Wisconsin, Iowa, pretty good mode? I think so, but it's a big year for Aiden Childs. He's kind of a great example of what we talked about, being able to watch a player develop where you can see his talent. Even to a relatively untrained eye like myself, it's when Zach and I go to games, he will hit these throws on a rope where you're just wow, not a lot of college quarterbacks make that throw. At the same time, he made a lot of mistakes, struggled with ball security, threw into coverage. And Zach and I talked a lot about this is everybody loves the quarterback who can make the highlight reel plays, but so much of being a quarterback is just executing the offense up and down the field and making the plays that are there. So it's going to be a big year for him. I mean, I think in his defense last year, the talent level was not that good. I mean, again, Zach and I joked, they haven't had nearly as much turnover as they had last year. And I mean, going into last season, Eric Harmon left. He just was a first-round draft pick, right? They had other guys where they were leaving after spring ball, and it's this is just not good. And they've had a little attrition this year, but not nearly the same amount. And the guys where you're just you can't replace. I mean, when you're a program like Michigan State, you lose a guy who's going in the first round, you're not replacing that. And that's, those types of having one or two of those game breakers on your defense can make a big difference. So it's a big year for them, aside from just the rivalry of like, again, can they take some steps to be competitive in some of these other games? And I want to go back to Sharon Moore and Michigan too, because I do think it's a big test for him, right? Of like, I mean, I think the offensive expectations, probably with a new quarterback, even a highly touted one, people are probably going to try to be a little cautious. Man, we just came off the draft, watching the draft, the talent that left on the defense is going to be extremely hard to replace. So I don't know what your outlook is, but it feels like the offense is going to have to take a step because they're not going to be just in every game with the I mean, they might have good players on defense coming up, but it seems hard to replace that level of NFL talent, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. They're going to have a good defense still. They have some good depth. Guys like Rayshon Benny is really good. There's several defensive guys who've have played a lot of football at Michigan who are going to be solid, but their ceiling is not just like, you can't run between the tackles because we have 2 first-round defensive tackles. Like, that makes football a lot easier. Now, they had some secondary issues last year that hopefully they'll be able to shore up. But if they don't, and then all of a sudden they're, a little leakier in the middle of the defense, their offense can't be as atrocious as it was, or they're going to lose a lot of games. They're not going to a bowl game unless their offense improves a lot. They're going to have to score. And not even just score, but, like, be able to stay on the field, to, like, flip the field, play field position, not, like, turn it over in your own end multiple times a game. Like, that's how I felt about Childs. Like, when it wasn't just not being able to run the offense, it was, like, disaster plays. In the Michigan game, I felt like they were conservative. Smith was conservative with the game plan, but it almost worked. Like, because if he wasn't, Childs probably would have turned it over 2 or 3 times, and it would have been not as close as it was. Like, so I thought it was a good game plan. Obviously, we won, so it's easy for me to give him credit for it. But
I mean, Zach and I were at the Boston College game, and it did feel like they in that game in particular, they moved up and down the field several times, but he threw 3 picks, and it's just like you're not winning a lot of games, turning it over that often. And that game, did it go to overtime, Zach, or was it just like last second that we lost the game? I remember it being very painful and us being very cold and wet.
Yeah, he threw an interception in the end zone to end the game.
That's right. Well, all right. I mean, we've gone for an hour and 40 minutes, so I guess I'll just say to bring it back to this team. Lloyd finished 9-4. This is how expectations go, right? I feel like both fan bases would take a 9-4 season pretty happily this upcoming season, right?
100%.
We would for sure. I see Pat's hesitating.
I mean, I think that would cause, I think yes, but I think that would cause some, like, there'd be a lot of questions around Sharon.
Interesting.
I would hope that people would give him more rope than that to, like, but the expectations are high now. He took over a program that was, like, rolling.
In the playoff 3 straight years. Yeah, that's true. I mean, as always, it probably depends on a little bit of the context, right? Of, like, do they lose to Ohio State and Michigan State and Penn State? Do they lose, like, who do they lose to and what are the scores? Are they competitive? I mean, I think, again, to get back to the 2007 season with Lloyd, it's not just that they go 9-4, it's that people were really feeling the embarrassment and, like you said, the feeling that they were just at their ceiling. So if Sharon goes 9-4 and one of those wins is against Ohio State and then they win a bowl game, probably people are feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I do think with conference realignment, like 9-4 now is a lot better than 9-4 then. Like,
Sure.
The schedules are just really hard. Like, you have to play Oregon and Washington instead of, like, I don't know.
App State.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, Illinois and Purdue, but yeah, pretty much. Like, they have a 9-game conference schedule, and there's going to be a lot more losable games than there was. Like, before, it was kind of tiered, where, like, you had the top tier, and they could maybe lose to a middle-tier team on the road. And then you kind of had a middle tier of, like, Big Ten teams that anything could happen any given week. And then you had, like, a bottom-tier team that was going to lose basically to everyone. Maybe they could steal a game from the middle tier, but they had no chance from the top tier. Yeah. It's still kind of that way, but I think that there's way more of like that upper tier. Like, I mean, Ohio State won the national championship and lost to Michigan. Like, Michigan was not seemed down and lost to Oregon. So I think that there's more parity and there's more matchups with teams that can, beat the good teams. So yeah, you might be right. I do think every year Sharon doesn't make the playoffs, there will be major questions. So he probably, especially with the expanded playoff, like that's the expectation now, is that we're going to be in the playoffs. And if we're not, it's a bad season. And if we are, it's pretty much a success, unless you lose basically to, Michigan State, Ohio State, and first playoff game, then that would be not good either. It's the landscape has changed.
All right, well, just looked it up. Michigan's win total 8.5. So Vegas says 9 wins would be a relative success. Zach,
that's the
Michigan State win total is 5.5. So
those are the regular season though. So that's in 12.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
true.
So if they went 9-3 and made the playoffs and then like lost a road playoff game, and weren't embarrassed or something, yeah, that we'd probably be happy with that. If they go 8-4 and win a meaningless bowl game, that's a lot less exciting of a season.
Seats getting warm. All right, well, it's we've been going. This is probably our longest pod yet. Not a surprise. We're talking about college football. Pat, I hope so we talked about 2007, but you got to talk about the current team. You got to talk about Harbaugh's national title. So hopefully it wasn't too painful doing this with a couple of Spartans. And Zach, it's not a video pod, so the audience won't see your numerous eye rolls anytime a Michigan football player's name was mentioned. But yeah, this was fun as always.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, we'll talk to y'all later, and yeah, we'll be back. We'll be back soon, hopefully, to do another college football team, and we've got some other fun ideas planned to keep this going. We'll talk to y'all later, and yeah, hope y'all have a great night.
Later.
See ya.